And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week, the portion of Chukat on discipline. A few weeks ago, we started the discussion of the three components that make up great leadership. We talked about courage. We talked about humility. We talked about courage and the idea in the sense that Caleb was a courageous person. He stood out. He stepped out. He showed himself. He got super vulnerable by putting himself really out there. He did whatever it would take to try to convince the people that the other spies were wrong and to convince them that it was okay to go into the land of Israel. He showed courage. The week before that, we talked about humility in the context of the most humble person that has ever lived, namely that of Moses. In the context of the story of his brother and sister speaking about him, the Bible described his humility. And we then spent time talking about what does it mean to be a humble person and what does it mean to develop humility and why that's important. And the third of the great leadership components is discipline. And this week's subject is discipline. Discipline comes up in a lot of different ways, and people describe it in all too many words. So what exactly does it mean to be disciplined? Self-discipline, work discipline, team discipline. And we're not discussing here disciplining someone, doing something to someone, punishing someone, or imposing a consequence, but really the notion of what does it mean to be a disciplined person, and how does one develop discipline? And I'm not even speaking about a person who naturally does things in a certain way, in a certain order, is naturally disciplined. I think that's a certain kind of person. I don't think that's most people. I think many people really perceive themselves to be procrastinators, lazy, undisciplined. And for many of us also, we are perhaps disciplined in certain areas, but not disciplined in other areas. And a lot of the time we can't figure out why. And there's a lot of science and research and study on the subject, and we're obviously never going to get all of it here. But the concept of discipline plays a role in this week's reading. The concept of discipline, as I understand it, and the way that I learned it and studied it in coaching, is the idea that you as a disciplined person, beyond your willingness to be courageous and beyond your willingness to establish and develop humility, meaning beyond your ability to come out of that comfort zone and beyond the ability to appreciate others and to know that other input is important and that you should consider other people, is then the work that's necessary to implement. The implementation of ideas. Not just building the strategy, but implementing the steps and working through the tasks that get you to the goal. It's executing at a very high level. And it's really living the process, even as I say to some people when I'm working on fundraising campaigns, loving the process too. It's the knowledge that if I do the work, really do the work, really put in the time and the effort, that on the other side of that, there will be an accomplishment, there will be success. So discipline is really that, is appreciating the process, living the process, developing it, and then implementing and executing at a very, very high level. It's not something that necessarily comes naturally to any of us, but it's something that is very important for our success. We don't need to have to sort of appreciate the use case, as we've done in other situations, or the business cases, to why self-discipline or discipline in general is important. We can appreciate that that is in fact the case. And in the Bible this week, how does that play itself out? The Bible tells us the story of Moses and Aaron hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And there are a whole host of explanations given by commentaries over the course of centuries as to what it is that Moses did wrong in that moment, and why it is that the consequence of his actions is not going into the land. He spent so many years preparing the people, so many years shepherding them and leading them, and so to have this one moment where he hits the rock instead of speaks to the rock, to be the moment that creates this consequence that he's not going in, is very, to some degree, enigmatic and very difficult for us to understand. And among the different ideas, I think, and one that I like to present here, is the idea that in violating the word of God, who said explicitly to speak to the rock in front of the people, and hitting the rock instead, that Moses violated a core discipline that was in place for decades. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you're the moral leader and the actual leader of a people, and you've been teaching them a certain way, and you've setting them up a certain way to go into the land, it does require a certain discipline. It's a discipline that Moses displayed consistently and constantly throughout all the years as a leader. The Bible also goes through many circumstances to tell us exactly that the people did exactly what God said, that Aaron did exactly what God said, that Moses did exactly what God said. And then it goes even further to tell us the circumstances when people did not do what it was that God said and the consequences that they faced. Namely, and most explicitly, the two sons of Aaron. The Bible specifically says there they did not do what God had commanded them. And so the discipline to stay focused and stay on task and to do what it is that God wants of us, it's to some degree fairly rigorous and not easy to do, but it does take that discipline to control the urge to do something else. Even in situations where Moses gets upset at the people or he's angry at them, he doesn't show it to them for the most part. Certainly even last week when we described the idea that when he got angry last week, because it was personal and all those other things, he went to God with his anger and his upsetness and his gripe, and not to the people. When the Bible says that he was angry, it doesn't say that the people saw him angry. It says that he spoke to God. And so the discipline to lead in that way, to be out front for so many years and so many decades in a certain manner, requires to some degree that in these kinds of moments when you may be frustrated, you may be angry, you maybe have had enough. I'm not necessarily that's the case with Moses, but that may be the case with us, that we cannot act out in that moment. And specifically in those moments is when we have to be the most careful and the most self-controlled so that we can execute in that moment. And so perhaps among all the other explanations, sort of along the line of what Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, known as the Netziv, writes in his commentary here, is that Moses, instead of speaking to the rock and hitting the rock, displayed the wrong action in the following way. The whole setup of now is to go into the land, and the Jewish people are about to enter the land of Israel, and Moses' job was to prepare them, to teach them, to set them up for success in the land. And one of the core things and key things that's going to happen in the land that's going to change from what they have now is their need to work the land and need to build the land. And really in that way also build up and strengthen their faith in God. And one of the ways that they're going to have to learn to really strengthen their faith in God is with respect to prayer or speaking to God. So it sounds counterintuitive. You would have thought that they would have to learn now how to work the land physically and how to plant. They'll get there. But also one of the things on the spiritual side is things are not going to be in front of them. They have to prepare and learn and to work for that. So hitting the rock doesn't provide that context. Standing there before the rock, speaking to the rock, praying to God would have provided the right frame and the right example, moral example, ethical example, religious example for the people in that specific moment right then and there as they're about to enter into the land. And so Moshe, in violating that, by not having that self-control, not having the discipline there, warrants not being allowed to go into the land. Aaron, therefore, as by extension, is connected to that, and he also, by extension, consequentially, is not allowed to go into the land. So discipline is one of those things that we are always working on, and one of the things that we really need to consistently build. And so it's important that we think about and develop our own discipline for ourselves, for our families, and of course for our teams as sort of the construct that we've dealt with here in coaching with the Bible over the course of, somewhere near 40 weeks at this point. And to give you that personal example for me, doing this week in and week out was a discipline that I wanted to develop in myself to consistently and constantly try to create new content and new material, new perspectives, a new vantage point, an additional reason for me to study the Bible on a regular basis and a weekly basis, to really think through these different ideas, to develop them, and then to share them, and to hear what people have to say back. And so that discipline was not a natural discipline for me, because it's not natural. That's what makes the self-discipline really important, is the work that goes into it. And so my thing had been initially was to publish on Wednesdays. As you all know, week to week was not going to happen. And so it's moved over to Friday. But for me, the initial discipline was just doing it the first week, doing the preparation, making the recording, learning the technologies necessary to get that out there, and then sharing. Then week 2 was doing it a little bit better, maybe a little bit earlier, thinking it a little bit more thoroughly, developing a little bit further. So now over the course of 30 plus weeks, it has become the discipline. It has become, for me, an expectation that week in, week out, I'm going to do that. I'm going to put that out there. Same thing that may be the case with a person who, with their exercise regimen. They may not necessarily be someone who likes to exercise, who wants to exercise, but to build up the practice, to become a person who habitually and ritually exercises, to not just simply be a person who does workouts, but they are now a person of exercise, a person of health, a person of well-being, takes the self-discipline to delay some sort of satisfaction, to delay some sort of gratification for the sake of what is now. Because today's workout and tomorrow's workout don't necessarily show themselves, but 50 workouts in, 100 workouts in, consistently every single day, a person sees the results on the other side. And so they're able to then get some benefit. That's the execution part. So even if we talk about people who are super talented or super smart, who have a ton of ideas, who are also courageous and who are also humble, the ability to be disciplined and then to execute in the face of reasons why not to is the power of self-discipline. It allows a person to really begin to A, accomplish, B, to move forward, C, to open up doors and other opportunities in front of them. And it really gives them just a greater set of opportunities in their own life. And so that self-control, which is what we're speaking about here, which is really the definition of what we're talking about, even in the cases where people run out of their, let's say, their will, or they're depleted of their desire to succeed, their motivation has been built up through the course of being disciplined over the course of time. And so we habituate and we ritualize a lot of different things, but we also need, with respect to this, with respect to the self-discipline, is to be consistent in that. And so, just as an example from the world, yes, habit and ritual is part of this. And famously, I mentioned this book probably 10 times in the course of Coaching with the Bible so far, Atomic Habits. So he mentions the Seinfeld effect, which I may have mentioned once before, but I'll mention it here again, was the idea of to be a comic and to really be a successful comic. Jerry Seinfeld used to write jokes every single day. Even if it was one joke, he would write it every day because he didn't want to break the chain. That was the buildup of the discipline, the self-discipline, to get to a space where ultimately the person will be successful. Is it a guarantee? No. Is it a guarantee that in the opposite situation, the person doesn't do anything that they're going to succeed at a very high level? Not likely. Are people naturally raw talented? Absolutely. But the discipline to work it through, to, if you're into sports and you're an athlete, to work on your swing, to work on your foul shot, to work on your form as a golfer or a swimmer, to extend the workout another few minutes, to read a few extra pages, to study a little bit further, or to study on a consistent basis day after day, that builds the discipline to success. One of the things that I did in the work with fundraising campaigns is the appreciation and the realization that no one is going to successfully raise a whole host of money if they don't do all the work that leads into the 24, 36, 40-hour period. All that work is the discipline and the execution that gives the person the opportunity to ultimately then have the gratification and have the success therein. So much of what's going on around us requires of us some level of discipline. And as a lot of people do say, a lot of the motivational speakers will talk about, that discipline will set you free. And the ability to put yourself in a box to some degree and to follow day after day, week after week, step after step, will allow you then on the other side to really have the freedom to do a lot of other things because you've been able to do that one thing. So what's really important then for us in the last couple of moments here with Coaching with the Bible for this week, in terms of how to do this and how to become more self-disciplined. So some will just say, well, just become more self-disciplined. I don't think that's true. I think there's a specific way to do this, perhaps, and this is based on the idea of Atomic Habits and some other books. It's really pick one thing. Pick one thing to really work on, something that's really bothering you, and really focus in on developing how to do that. Get people around you. We've talked about this for other things too. Get people around you who are going to support you, are going to help you. Put the technology in place necessarily that could help you too. So for example, if it's a writing habit that you want to develop, or you want to develop the discipline of becoming a writer, so then establish that you're going to publish on Thursdays. And then work backwards. What does that mean? If I'm going to publish on Thursdays, what do I have to do the rest of the time? Really get comfortable with being uncomfortable. A lot of people say, and we said that around courage, but that's also part of discipline. By virtue of being comfortable with the uncomfortable, then you're stepping into the idea that you realize that you're not there yet, that you have work to do, and that you can ultimately get to the space that you want. And then picking that one thing, create in that one thing specific, easy goals first. And then prepare yourself for the start. One thing I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again here, is the idea that you want to prepare yourself to be successful at the start. So if you want to become a writer, then obviously you need writing utensils. If you want to become an athlete, you need something to do that's going to help you become more athletic. But also appreciate that you may miss a day, and that you should forgive yourself for missing that day. Just don't miss 2 days. James Clear in the book Atomic Habits mentions that idea, that you want to reestablish the streak as quickly as possible because that helps you get back on target, helps you get refocused, and helps you then build that self-discipline that you want. So again, even as I'm clear and I understand, and I think we all do, that what's going on with Moses and Aaron in that moment is a lot more than just a question of discipline. But I do think that that's an important component of the overall march that is the arc and march of Moses' career over the course of 40 years. That discipline was there, and it wasn't there in this moment, and it was really crucial and really necessary for what's about to happen for the Jewish people and the people of Israel as they enter into the land. Okay, that is Coaching with the Bible for this week. Those celebrating Shabbat Shalom, see you next week.